The first person Daniel Hartley saw when he stepped off the long-distance coach was his own reflection in the glass doors of the small-town station, and for a brief moment he barely recognized himself. The tailored suits and polished shoes that had become his armor in the city were gone. In their place were worn jeans, a faded jumper, and scuffed trainers. He had chosen them carefully, not to deceive strangers, but to see the truth about the people who mattered most to him. For 20 years, Daniel had lived in London, building a technology company from a cramped flat into a global success. His name had appeared in magazines, his face on conference banners, and his signature on contracts, worth more than he could have imagined as a boy growing up in the quiet town of Willowbrook. But fame and fortune had brought an uncomfortable question that never seemed to leave him alone. Had success changed his family, or had it simply revealed who they really were? He hadn't told anyone he was coming. Not his older brother, Marcus, who ran their late father's hardware shop. Not his sister, Rebecca, who managed a small cafe near the Green. And not his mother, Evelyn, who still lived in the modest brick house where they had all been raised. He wanted to arrive as a stranger, someone with nothing to offer but a tired smile and a hopeful heart. Daniel slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and walked through familiar streets that suddenly felt both comforting and distant. The bakery still smelled of warm bread. The post office still had the same crooked sign, but the people he passed barely glanced at him. To them, he was just another traveler, another face that would soon be forgotten. His first stop was the hardware shop. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. Marcus was behind the counter, his sleeves rolled up, talking to a customer about paint samples. He looked older, his hair flecked with gray, his movements slower than Daniel remembered. When the customer left, Daniel approached the counter. "Excuse me," Daniel said gently. "I was wondering if you might know of any short-term work around town. I've just arrived and could use a few days of honest work to get back on my feet." Marcus looked him up and down, his eyes lingering on the scuffed trainers. For a moment, his face showed hesitation. The shop wasn't busy, and times had been tight lately. Daniel could see the internal struggle flicker across his brother's features. "We're not really hiring," Marcus said slowly, "but I could use help reorganizing the back room. It's not glamorous, and I can't pay much." Daniel felt a quiet warmth spread through him. "That would mean a lot." "Thank you." Marcus nodded and handed him a broom and a stack of dusty boxes. Daniel spent the next hour sweeping floors, sorting shelves, and listened as Marcus chatted about the challenges of keeping the shop running. There was no suspicion in his voice, no hint that he recognized the brother he hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. When Daniel finished, Marcus paid him in cash and even pressed a sandwich into his hand. "You look like you could use this," Marcus said with a small smile. Daniel stepped back into the sunlight, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. Later that afternoon, he wandered toward Rebecca's cafe. It was busier than the hardware shop, filled with laughter, the clink of cups, and the smell of fresh coffee. Rebecca was behind the counter, her hair tied back, her eyes focused on a long line of customers. Daniel waited patiently until the rush eased. "Hi," he said softly. "I was hoping you might need a hand. I can wash dishes, clean tables, anything, really." Rebecca looked tired, but her smile was kind. "We're usually fully staffed," she replied. Then she glanced around the cafe, at the overflowing dish rack and the crumbs on the floor. "But today's been hectic. If you're willing to help for a couple of hours, I can manage something." Daniel spent the afternoon wiping tables, washing cups, and listening to Rebecca joke with customers. She offered him a warm meal at the end of his shift and asked where he was staying. When he said he wasn't sure yet, her brow furrowed with concern. "There's a small guest house near the river," she said. "It's not expensive, and it's clean. You should try there." Daniel thanked her, his throat tight, As evening settled over Willowbrook, Daniel made his final stop at the house that still felt like home, even after all these years. He stood at the gate for a long moment, memories rising in waves. Then he took a deep breath and knocked. Evelyn opened the door slowly, her eyes curious but gentle. "Yes, I'm sorry to bother you," Daniel said, lowering his gaze. "I've just arrived in town and was wondering if you might know of any place I could stay for a night or two. I can pay a little, and I won't be any trouble." Evelyn studied him carefully. She was quieter than Marcus and Rebecca, her expressions more reserved. For a moment, Daniel feared she might turn him away. Then she opened the door wider. "You look tired," she said softly. "Come in. You can stay in the spare room. We'll talk about the rest later." Inside, the house smelled of tea and old books. Evelyn poured him a cup and asked simple questions about his travels. She didn't pry. She didn't judge. She simply listened. When she showed him to the spare room, she left a folded blanket on the bed and a small lamp glowing softly in the corner. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his emotions swirling. His family had welcomed a stranger without knowing who he was, without expecting anything in return. They had given him time, work, food, and shelter simply because he needed it. The next morning, he gathered them together in the living room. Marcus arrived first, then Rebecca, both surprised to be called so early. Evelyn sat quietly in her armchair, her hands folded in her lap. Daniel stood before them, his heart pounding. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a small framed photo, one that showed 3 children sitting on the front steps of this very house, laughing into the camera. Marcus's eyes widened. Rebecca covered her mouth. Evelyn's breath caught. "It's me," Daniel said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I wanted to know if you loved me for who I am, not for what I have, and you showed me that you do." For a moment no one spoke. Then Rebecca crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. Marcus followed, gripping his shoulder tightly. Evelyn rose slowly and placed her hands on his cheeks, tears shining in her eyes. "You were always our family," she said. Nothing else ever mattered. Daniel stayed in Willowbrook for several weeks. He quietly paid off Marcus's shop debts, upgraded Rebecca's cafe equipment, and arranged for repairs to his mother's house. But more than that, he spent time, long walks, shared meals, simple conversations that meant more to him than any boardroom victory ever had. When he finally returned to the city, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. He knew now that kindness didn't depend on wealth, and love didn't require recognition. His family had reminded him that the truest measure of success was not what you could gain, but what you were willing to give, even to a stranger who had nothing but hope in his eyes.